Hey everyone, Mr. Jeffersonian here, and if you haven't heard about Anchor, let me explain. It's the easiest way to make a podcast. First off, it's free, and who doesn't like that? There are creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer, and Anchor will distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and many more. You can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast all in one place. So the call to action is download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. Howdy everyone, and thank you again for tuning in to the Jeffersonian Tradition. Before we get started, I have a couple of things to go over. For now, the podcast is mostly ad-free, and I sure would like to keep it that way. You can help me out with that by becoming a supporting listener. If you found value in the podcast, there is a link in the show notes page that will enable you to contribute to my work and to help keep the podcast going and keep the show light on advertising. Contributions start as low as 99 cents per month, with two other brackets at $4.99 per month or $9.99 per month. If you aren't comfortable with a recurring contribution model, I've also set up a Cash App profile for the show. One-time contributions can be sent through Cash App to the show's cash tag, which is $Mr. Jeffersonian, and that information is also included in the show notes page. And I do want to take a moment and give a massive shout out to the show's very first supporting listener, Mr. Christopher Hendricks. Chris is a member of the show's MeWe group and is a gentleman and a scholar. Thank you so much for your contributions, Chris, and remember that you're the real MVP. Any contribution amounts help, and thank you in advance to anyone who chooses to pitch in. In other show-related news, if there is a topic you'd like for me to cover, or if you just have general questions for me, I can be contacted at the show email address, which again is mrjeffersonian@outlook.com. or through the show's MeWe group, which is also titled The Jeffersonian Tradition. If you're not yet a member of the show's MeWe group, one, what are you waiting for? But two, download the MeWe app, send me a contact request. You can find me at Mr. Jeffersonian or the username Mr. Jeffersonian. And for those who are not familiar with MeWe, being contacts is the same as being friends on Facebook. The show is private, so we do have to be contacts first before I can send the invitation out. With all of that fun stuff out of the way, let's now turn our attention to the topic for today's episode, which is the Nullification Crisis of 1832. This episode will be the first of three, and today we're primarily going to focus on the driving force behind the build-up to 1832, which was the Tariff of 1828, otherwise known as the Tariff of Abominations. All right, so just some backdrop. Protectionist politicians and citizens first came on the scene as early as 1789, at least in America. Now, they had existed in Great Britain prior to that. That was the whole basis of the mercantilist system that Britain had at the time. But the American protectionists were mainly under the influence of Alexander Hamilton. However, there was not really a prominent protectionist movement until the Embargo Act of 1807, which happened under the Thomas Jefferson administration. And then that movement really came to force with the War of 1812, since almost all foreign trade ground to a halt during the war, and the prevailing thought at that point was that the Union needed to have strong domestic manufacturers in order to be self-sufficient. That makes some sense. Obviously, if you're going to be heavily reliant on British goods, then you're going to have very strong incentives not to go to war with Britain, even if they are being pretty aggressive towards you. So, at least in theory, that does make a little bit of sense. But during and after this period, there was a persistent and loud faction in favor of protectionist policies in the general government. And that faction was primarily made up of New Englanders and Western states. And at the time, the Western states would have been states like Ohio, Kentucky, Indiana, Illinois, so on and so forth, not yet the far west like the Rocky Mountain states. Now, from 1816 to 1828, the tariff policy of the Union experienced both upward and downward fluctuations, but in 1828, an incredibly bizarre situation unfolded. Northern manufacturers in the middle states of New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania wanted a tariff on raw woolens and woolen goods, citing the alleged success of protective cotton textiles tariffs in the early 1800s as justification for such a policy. And so what happened there, cotton had some, cotton textiles, so more so the factories who would turn raw cotton into finished products, they had some protective measures, and it was assumed that they were very successful because it did not take cotton very long to be able to stand on its own feet, or the cotton textile industry. It didn't take very long for America to have a very competitive market. And so the thought process here is they wanted to apply the same thought pattern to wool. Now, one of the big problems with this is that America at the time had natural barriers to being able to have a viable wool market, and most of the wool that we consumed at that point seems to have been imported from either Spain or Great Britain. And so that was a flawed concept from the start, just because, again, we didn't really have too much of a viable sheep market. I don't really know exactly why that was. I'm not familiar with the husbandry of sheep, but we didn't really have a viable setup to be able to do large-scale sheep farming and wool culling or wool gathering. So that was kind of flawed from the start, but these manufacturers wanted that sort of a tariff, and they wanted it primarily to prop up woolen goods manufacturers in the middle states, in the mid-Atlantic states. So again, that would be New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, so on and so forth. Now, Western states supported this tariff as well, along with making appeals to the general government to provide federally funded internal improvements. There was also a large minority of Northern Democrats who did not favor protectionist policies, believing them to be unconstitutional, and they were aligned with the federal politicians of the South, who were almost universally pro-free trade. Long story short, there was an extremely convoluted scheme that was concocted by by then Senator of New York, Martin Van Buren, whereby the Southern and Northern Democratic coalition would draft a tariff bill that was incredibly antagonistic to the pro-tariff Northern faction. And this faction, so this Northern faction who was pro-tariff, they were very strongly unified behind John Quincy Adams. Now, John Quincy Adams was a very unpopular president. We'll touch on this in episode 2, and we'll kind of go a little bit more in depth on the backstory. But suffice it to say, John Quincy Adams, the way he gained the presidency was highly corrupt and very suspicious. So he was looked at as a purely sectional president there to basically try to advocate for policies that would favor the Northeast. And so he was not a very popular president. But the pro-tariff Northern faction of the general government, they were very strongly unified behind Adams. So again, that kind of drives home the point that he was a sectional president. Now, as far as the actual tariff itself, or the plan behind the tariff, so the plan was that once the bill was presented, the North-South anti-tariff coalition would refuse any amendments to it, and that it was believed to be so toxic to the Northeast that it would force even them to reject the tariff, while allowing the Western faction to save face by supporting the tariff and pointing to overwhelming opposition as to the reason it wasn't passed. This was important because the Western faction was trying to paint itself as a friend of domestic industry at the time. So, and another reason it's important, the anti-tariff group, they were pretty much hell-bent on just trying to make sure they did whatever it took for John Quincy Adams not to win re-election in 1828. So they were all basically Jacksonians, or they had cast their lots with Andrew Jackson, who was going to be their presumed candidate when the election of 1828 happened. And so they just wanted to make the New England section, they wanted to make this so toxic to them that even the pro-tariff folks would reject it, and thereby just delegitimize John Quincy Adams because he was very pro-tariff, and from there just make sure they did everything they could to sink him. Now, of note, ironically enough, the bill as drafted was also highly punitive to Southerners, as they did not want to pay the high importation duties of raw wool and woolen goods. They were also afraid that having such a tariff against their European trading partners would drive these European countries to reduce or halt the importation of Southern exports. The plan, at least according to John C. Calhoun, also required that the North-South anti-tariff coalition stay true to the free trade argument and ultimately vote against passage of their own bill in the Senate. So in other words, the idea was to have political gridlock, and their goal was actually to have no new tariff changes in that legislative session. Now, unsurprisingly, the proposal got enough votes to pass the House of Representatives, but to the surprise of many politicians of the day, enough northern senators were persuaded by Daniel Webster to vote in favor of this toxic bill. So even though it was punitive to them, they voted in favor of it, or the northern pro-tariff folks, they swallowed the bitter pill, basically. But then a few southern senators also broke ranks and voted in favor. And thus, the outcome was the passage of a tariff that no one wanted, the Tariff of Abominations. Now, you may be asking why this particular tariff was so loathsome to the two dominant sections of the country. So let me explain. The way that it was punitive against the North was that molasses would be taxed at 10 cents per gallon, which was an increase from 5 cents prior to. Many Northerners used imported molasses in distilling rum. And so you had Northerners who would just import thousands upon thousands of gallons of molasses. Again, they had a rum industry up there, or a spirits industry up there, and they relied on the imported molasses that were cheaper to make their product and get it to market. So that's one way, because it would be a tax on their consumption. Now, the duties on hemp would increase from $35 to $45 per ton, with an additional $5 annual increase until the duty reached $60 per ton for hemp. And this was the same for flax. So although this was going to be a burden to the Northeast, it would be a boon to the West, because Kentucky in particular had a pretty decent sized number of hemp growers. Now, the Northeast, the reason that this matters for the Northeast is because they relied almost exclusively on imported hemp and flax to make rope, cordage, all that good stuff for ships. So their political economy was still highly based around the shipping industry. So this would be an extremely punitive measure against the Northeast, because they're shipbuilders, ship owners, so on and so forth. This would be a heavy, heavy tax on their business model. And so it was thought that this would, again, be a toxic pill to the Northeast, and they would reject it because, hey, it's basically going to target their main source of income. But surprisingly enough, again, Daniel Webster persuaded enough northern senators to vote in favor, and so they took the bitter pill. Now, the way in which it was punitive against the South is that the duty on wool and woolen goods would be increased to a minimum of 4 cents per pound, with an additional 40% rate of the market price, which would increase to 45% in 1829 and 50% in 1830 and beyond. Now, the South vehemently opposed such a heavy tariff on wool for two main reasons. One, they imported literal tons of woolen goods to clothe their substantial slave population. So it seems that at this time, again, that most of our wool was imported from Spain and or Great Britain. And again, there were natural limits on the viability of sheep raising domestically. So the South opposed it because they just didn't see a way to get around it. Whereas in the North, they could turn to Kentucky, which, although it wasn't nearly as large scale as the production of hemp in other places, Kentucky at least was making the attempt. Whereas in the South, they just didn't see a way to get around it because there was not going to be a cheaper alternative. It was pay highly inflated domestic prices or pay artificially inflated foreign prices because of the tariff. Now, they were afraid that such stiff measures would bar their agricultural products from European markets should any European countries retaliate with tariffs of their own, which would have caused severe economic depression in the South. And so again, the North had kind of a backdoor here, because anything that the North was using, either it could be produced domestically or it wouldn't necessarily hurt them in terms of their overall political economy because they didn't export. The South, on the other hand, they were an exporting section, so they relied heavily on being able to ship their agricultural products over to European markets, and in exchange, they would get raw materials like wool, iron, all kinds of stuff to build up the South. So the states would take that in, or actually the general government would take in the tariff revenue. But prior to the tariff, the states would work on this, and the states would use the revenue that was generated by all this economic activity to fund their own internal improvements and things of that nature. Now, the boon here, the boon from the tax on wool and woolen goods, again, was going to go to northern textile manufacturers with the hope that states such as New York could create an internationally competitive market for fine woolen goods, and not just the coarse woolen items that they were known for at that time. So we had a small woolen good manufacturing base at this point in history. But they primarily just produce what were called coarse woolen items like blankets. Now, iron duties would also be increased significantly across the board. Pig iron would increase from 56 cents per hundredweight to 62 cents. Bar iron would increase, or hammered bar would increase from 90 cents per hundredweight to $1.12 per hundredweight. And then rolled bar would increase from $30 per ton to $37 per ton. And again, the South relied heavily on imported iron to expand its small but rapidly increasing railroad lines. This would serve as a major setback to their industrialization, as it became cost prohibitive to continue building at such a fast pace. Now, a lot of people don't know this, but the South actually at this point, they had been pretty rapidly expanding their railroad network. Now, their railroads weren't as, I would say, strategic as the North, especially by the time you get to the War for Southern Independence. The North has a very broad, sprawling network with key connections pretty much across the board. The South, on the other hand, was just kind of a series of disconnected short lines to get crops from one place to another. So, now, particularly galling to them at this time in history, so again, back in 1828, is that it was widely acknowledged that the domestic iron manufacturers, primarily located in Pennsylvania and New Jersey and a couple of other northern states, were beyond the point of needing protection to keep them from being driven out of business by foreign competition. And so, interestingly enough, prior to this tariff bill being proposed, some of the leading iron manufacturers actually had to testify before Congress, and they actually said we don't need a tariff. But the North haggled and got this included, and it became really, really a thorn in the southern section side. And so clearly, we're going to have some friction there, because the South again is like, oh hey, we shouldn't have tried to make this type of bargain, and they kind of regret it that they supported it to begin with in the House of Representatives. So it's a long, convoluted story there, but yes. So basically, what we ended up with was, again, a tariff that nobody actually wanted, because there was supposed to be this convoluted scheme of, oh, we'll gesture here and we'll feign support for it, and then we're going to turn our backs on it. That was the anti-tariff coalition. But again, enough people broke ranks that plan didn't really play itself out. So it was unfortunate because it was avoidable. Now, we're going to go ahead and wrap it up here for today's episode. In our next release, we're going to follow the events of today through to the election of Andrew Jackson and the events of his first term that would help to set the stage for the full-blown domestic crisis that would engulf the young federal republic. But the main takeaway from today's episode is don't play chicken when you have a potentially countrywide crisis brewing as a result of doing so. Just go ahead, go there, stick to your guns, and make sure that legislation that shouldn't be passed is not passed. Don't leave it to chance that some people could break away and surprise you. So in closing, I want to give Chris a final shout out. So thanks again, Chris, for being the very first supporting listener of the Jeffersonian Tradition. And folks, please remember, if you find value in the podcast, to consider contributing to the show. You can contribute on a recurring basis through the supporting listener anchor link in the show notes page, or you can make a one-time contribution by using the show's Cash App information, which is also included in the show notes page. Any contribution amounts help, and thank you again to everyone in advance who decides to do so. All right, with another episode in the books, thank you again for tuning in, and I'll talk to y'all next time.